The garden party at the Whitmore estate looked perfect, except for the 9-year-old deaf boy sitting alone, unreachable despite the elite nannies hovering nearby, and a billionaire father who had tried everything money could buy. 7 months of silence. Dozens of failed specialists. And then a maid nobody noticed saw something in the way his fingers moved across the tablecloth. A pattern, a language, a desperate attempt to be understood. They said reaching him was impossible. They were about to learn what impossible really means. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the oak trees surrounding the Whitmore estate, casting elegant shadows across tables draped in crisp white linen. Crystal glasses caught the light like diamonds, and the gentle clink of silverware created a symphony of wealth and refinement. Grant Whitmore moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his tailored navy suit fitting him like armor. He shook hands with investors, nodded at donors, and smiled at the right moments. Everything had been choreographed to perfection. The garden party was meant to showcase not just his financial empire, but his life itself, a monument to success that couldn't be questioned. Yet at a small table near the rose garden, removed from the main gathering, sat a crack in that perfect facade. Elliot Whitmore was 9 years old, with sandy blonde hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds. He sat perfectly still, his small hands resting on either side of an untouched plate of food. Grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, a delicate pasta salad, all arranged beautifully, all growing cold. His gaze fixed on something in the middle distance, somewhere beyond the flowers and the guests and the careful pretense surrounding him. He didn't fidget. He didn't look around. He simply existed in a space that seemed entirely separate from everything else. 3 women hovered near his table like anxious birds. They wore matching uniforms, polo shirts, and khaki pants that marked them as staff, though their posture suggested they considered themselves something more. The tallest one, a woman named Jessica, with highlighted brown hair, pulled into a tight ponytail, leaned toward Elliot with exaggerated slowness. Her hands moved in broad, sweeping gestures, her face twisted into an expression that might have been meant as encouraging but looked more like frustration wearing a mask. "Elliot," she said, her voice too loud and too slow. "Eat your food." Her hands made clumsy shapes in the air, signs that resembled actual sign language the way a child's drawing resembles a photograph. Elliot's eyes flickered toward her for the briefest moment, then slid away as if she were made of glass. The dismissal was absolute. Jessica's jaw tightened. She straightened, sharing a look with the other 2 nannies. The second woman, Rachel, had auburn hair and glasses that kept sliding down her nose. She adjusted them nervously before trying her own approach. "Maybe he's not hungry," Rachel suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. She crouched beside Elliot's chair, attempting to catch his line of sight. "Elliot, can you look at me, sweetheart?" Nothing. Not even a blink of acknowledgement. The third nanny, Bethany, crossed her arms over her chest. She was older than the others, somewhere in her 50s, with gray streaks in her dark hair and lines around her mouth that suggested years of dealing with difficult children. "He knows we're here," she said quietly. "He's choosing to ignore us." "We should try the visual cards again," Rachel said, pulling a laminated set from her pocket. Each card showed a simple picture: a fork, a glass of water, a bathroom, a bed. She held them up one at a time, speaking slowly and clearly. "Do you need anything, Elliot? Water? Bathroom?" Elliot's fingers twitched slightly where they rested on the table, but otherwise he remained motionless. The cards might as well have been invisible. From across the lawn, several guests had begun to notice. A man in a gray suit leaned toward his companion and whispered something behind his hand. A woman in a floral dress glanced at the children's table, then quickly away, her expression uncomfortable. The whispers spread like ripples on water, quiet but impossible to ignore. Grant Whitmore stood near the bar area, a glass of scotch in his hand that he hadn't touched. He appeared to be listening to a silver-haired investor discuss market projections, nodding at appropriate intervals. But his attention kept drifting to that small table beneath the roses. He watched Jessica's frustrated gestures, Rachel's pleading attempts at connection, Bethany's rigid disapproval. He watched his son sit like a statue, unreachable and alone despite being surrounded. His jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped in his cheek. To anyone watching him, Grant looked calm, controlled, perhaps slightly bored by the conversation. Only someone who knew him well would recognize the fury and helplessness warring beneath that composed surface. He took a small sip of scotch, letting it burn down his throat, and force himself to turn back to the investor. The third quarter projections look solid, he said smoothly, as if nothing in the world could touch him. It had been 7 months since Elliot stopped responding. 7 months since the morning Grant found his wife, Catherine, collapsed in their bedroom, an aneurysm having stolen her away in the night without warning or mercy. 7 months since Elliot had watched the paramedics work frantically, had seen his father's face crumble, had felt his entire world shatter into pieces too small to ever fit back together. For the first month, everyone said it was normal. Grief took time. Children processed loss differently. Be patient. Give him space. But as weeks turned into months, Elliot's silence deepened into something more concerning. He stopped responding to his name, stopped making eye contact, stopped engaging with the world entirely. The therapist called it trauma-linked withdrawal. The doctors ran tests and found nothing physically wrong. The specialists suggested time, patience, specialized care. Grant had thrown money at the problem like it was a fire he could smother with cash. He hired the best child psychologists in the country. He brought in speech therapists, occupational therapists, behavioral specialists. He employed nannies with credentials longer than his arm, women who had worked with deaf children in prestigious schools, who held certifications from renowned institutions, who came with glowing references and confident promises. None of them lasted more than 2 weeks. They all said the same things, eventually. Elliot was too withdrawn, too resistant to intervention, too traumatized to reach. Some suggested medication. Others recommended residential programs. All of them eventually quit. Each failure felt like another confirmation of something Grant couldn't bear to admit, that maybe his son was broken in a way that couldn't be fixed, that maybe money and power and influence couldn't solve everything, that maybe he had failed at the one thing that actually mattered. Near the dessert table, a woman in a simple black uniform moved quietly among the guests. She wore no name tag, no distinctive markings. Her dark skin gleamed in the afternoon light, and her hair was pulled back into a neat bun at the base of her neck. She carried a tray, collecting empty glasses and plates, refilling water glasses without being asked. Most guests didn't look at her directly. She was part of the invisible machinery that made events like this run smoothly, present but not acknowledged, essential but not seen. Her name was Naomi Clark, and she had been working at the Whitmore estate for exactly 3 weeks. She had been hired through a staffing agency after the previous maid left abruptly, something about the atmosphere being too tense. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, had interviewed Naomi briefly, asked a few perfunctory questions about her experience, and hired her on the spot. They needed someone who could start immediately, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions, someone who understood that working for a family like the Whitmores meant maintaining absolute discretion. Naomi understood all of that. She needed the job. The pay was better than anywhere else she had worked, and it came with housing, a small room in the staff quarters that was clean and private. She kept her head down, did her work efficiently, and tried not to draw attention to herself. But she couldn't help noticing things. As she moved through the garden party, clearing away champagne flutes and replacing them with fresh ones, her gaze kept returning to the small table near the roses. She watched the nannies hover and gesture and fail. She watched the little boy sit in his bubble of isolation, and she noticed things that no one else seemed to see. She noticed how Elliot's fingers twitched whenever someone spoke too loudly near him. Not a flinch exactly, but a subtle response that suggested he was aware of vibrations, of changes in air pressure, of the physical presence of sound, even if he couldn't hear it. She noticed how his eyes would track movement in his peripheral vision, following patterns and gestures even when he appeared not to be looking. She noticed how he would mirror people unconsciously. When Jessica crossed her arms, Elliot's shoulders would tense in the same protective posture. When Rachel leaned forward, Elliot would lean slightly back, maintaining distance. Most telling of all, she noticed that Elliot would freeze whenever someone noticed him noticing, as if awareness itself was dangerous, as if being seen meant being vulnerable. Naomi paused near the bar to collect a cluster of empty glasses. As she straightened, she heard Jessica's voice rise in barely controlled frustration. "Elliot, this is not acceptable behavior. You need to eat your lunch now." The sharpness in her tone made Naomi's hands still on the tray. She watched as Jessica reached toward Elliot's plate, as if to physically guide his hand to the fork. Elliot pulled his hands into his lap, so quickly it was almost violent, his entire body going rigid. "Don't touch him like that," Bethany said sharply to Jessica. "You know what the protocols say." "The protocols aren't working," Jessica hissed back. "Nothing is working. He's being deliberately difficult." Naomi felt something twist in her chest. Not quite anger, but close. Alert. Protective. She didn't know this child. She had no right to feel anything about how he was treated. But the word deliberately echoed in her mind with a wrongness that made her jaw tight. She moved on, continuing her work, but the feeling stayed with her. Near the rose garden, Grant excused himself from the investor and walked toward his son's table. The nannies straightened immediately, their expressions shifting to something more professional, more controlled. Grant stopped a few feet away, not approaching too closely. He looked at his son, really looked at him, and for just a moment his carefully constructed mask slipped. The grief and helplessness showed through, raw and undeniable. Then he locked it away again. He turned to Jessica. "How is he today?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Jessica hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "He's having a difficult afternoon, Mr. Whitmore. We've tried several approaches, but he's not responding to any of our interventions." Grant's eyes returned to Elliot. His son hadn't acknowledged his presence at all, hadn't even turned his head. "Has he eaten anything?" "No, sir." "Has he signed anything? Made any attempt to communicate?" "No, sir. Not since this morning." Grant nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Keep trying," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. What else was there to say? What else was there to do? He walked away before anyone could see the defeat in his eyes. The party continued for another 2 hours. Guests mingled and laughed and discussed business over expensive wine. The sun moved across the sky, and the shadows grew longer. Eventually, people began to leave, offering gracious thanks and promising to stay in touch. Grant played his part perfectly, shaking hands and accepting compliments on the lovely event. As the last guest departed, Naomi was near the children's table, collecting the scattered debris of the party. The nannies had finally given up and taken Elliot inside. His untouched plate still sat on the table, the food congealed and unappealing. As Naomi reached for it, she noticed something she had missed before. The fork beside the plate had been moved. Not randomly, deliberately. It had been positioned to form a perfect perpendicular angle with the knife, creating a precise T-shape. The spoon had been placed above them, equidistant from both edges. The water glass had been rotated so that the small chip in its rim faced exactly north. It was a pattern, a deliberate, careful pattern that someone with acute spatial awareness might create. Not chaos, not withdrawal, communication. Naomi stood there for a long moment, staring at the geometric arrangement. Then she carefully photographed it with her eyes, committing every angle to memory before clearing the table away. That evening, a guest comment drifted back to Grant through the grapevine, the way cruel observations always did. Someone had said it to someone else, who had mentioned it to a board member, who had felt obligated to pass it along. Poor kid, all that money and still broken. The word landed like a physical blow. Broken, as if Elliot were a toy that had stopped working. As if grief and trauma and the loss of the only person who truly understood him were mechanical failures that could be fixed with the right tools and enough money. Grant dismissed his staff early that night. He poured himself another scotch, This one he actually intended to drink and sat alone in his office. The room was dark except for the glow of his laptop screen. He opened a folder he told himself he wouldn't open anymore. Videos. Dozens of them. Catherine and Elliot, filmed over the years on phones and cameras, casual moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time. He clicked on one from 2 years ago. Summer. Catherine and Elliot sitting in this very garden, sunshine pouring over them like liquid gold. Catherine's hands moved in fluid, graceful signs, and Elliot responded with his own gestures, quick and confident and full of life. They were laughing. Both of them. Elliot's face was open and bright, completely unlike the closed, distant mask he wore now. Catherine signed something complex, her expression playful. Elliot signed back, giggling. The sound was silent in the video, just the whisper of wind through trees and distant bird songs. But Grant remembered what it had sounded like. His son's laughter, high and clear and absolutely joyful. Grant watched for 2 minutes. Then he slammed the laptop shut, unable to bear anymore. In the darkness of his office, surrounded by symbols of his success, awards and photographs and expensive furniture, Grant Whitmore put his head in his hands and wondered how he had failed so completely at the only thing that mattered. Naomi Clark's room in the staff quarters was small but comfortable. A narrow bed with clean white sheets, a dresser with 4 drawers, a small window that looked out over the service driveway. She had been living in it for 3 weeks, and it still felt temporary. She hadn't hung anything on the walls or put photographs on the dresser. She kept her belongings minimal, ready to pack quickly if necessary. She had learned early in life not to get too attached to places. Naomi grew up in a small town in North Carolina, the daughter of a single mother who worked as a nurse. Her mother, Diana, had taken double shifts at the county hospital for as long as Naomi could remember, coming home exhausted, sleeping for a few hours, then heading back out before dawn. There had never been much money, never much time, but there had been love, fierce and uncompromising, and a work ethic that bordered on holy. When Naomi was 11, her cousin Marcus came to live with them. He was 8 years old, deaf since birth, and his parents, Diana's brother and sister-in-law, had died in a car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside Charlotte. There was no one else to take him in. Diana didn't hesitate. She brought Marcus home, cleared out the spare room that had been used for storage, and told Naomi that family took care of family, no matter what. Marcus arrived silent and terrified, clutching a worn stuffed dog and refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The social worker who brought him explained that he had some sign language education, but was delayed for his age. He had behavioral issues. He struggled with change. He would need special schools, therapists, accommodations. Diana listened to all of it, thanked the social worker, and closed the door. Then she looked at Naomi and said, "We'll figure it out." And they did. Not with money or experts or special programs. They figured it out by paying attention, by watching Marcus closely, learning what made him feel safe and what made him withdraw, by teaching themselves sign language from library books and free community classes, by making mistakes and trying again. Naomi learned that signing wasn't just about making the right shapes with your hands. It was about expression, intention, emotional clarity. You could sign "I love you" in a way that felt perfunctory and distant, or in a way that wrapped the person in warmth. The difference wasn't in the technical execution. It was in whether you meant it. She learned that Marcus communicated even when he wasn't signing, that his body language told stories, that the way he arranged his toys, or tapped his fingers, or avoided certain rooms all meant something. You just had to pay attention. You had to care enough to see. By the time Marcus was 12 and Naomi was 15, he was a different child. Confident, expressive, playful. He still faced challenges. School was hard. Other kids could be cruel. The world wasn't built for him. But he had a foundation. He had people who saw him. Naomi had always planned to become a certified interpreter. She had the skills. She had the passion. But life had a way of interrupting plans. Her mother got sick during Naomi's senior year. Cancer, aggressive and cruel. The medical bills piled up faster than Diana's insurance could cover them. Naomi graduated high school and went straight to work, taking whatever job she could find to help pay for treatment. Diana fought hard, but she lost anyway. She died 3 weeks before Naomi's 21st birthday. Marcus went to live with another relative, an aunt in Virginia who could provide the stability and structure he needed. Naomi was left alone, drowning in debt, with no degree and no clear path forward. She worked her way through her 20s doing whatever paid the bills. Waitressing, retail, cleaning houses. She moved from town to town, never settling, never building anything permanent. She kept her sign language sharp by practicing alone in her apartments at night, running through vocabulary and grammar, keeping the language alive even though she had no one to use it with. She told herself she would go back to school eventually, get certified, build a real career, but eventually kept getting pushed further into the future, always just out of reach. Now, at 32, she was cleaning tables at a billionaire's estate and sleeping in staff quarters. It wasn't where she had imagined herself ending up, but at least it was stable. At least it was something. On her 4th day at the Whitmore estate, Mrs. Patterson called Naomi into her office. The head housekeeper was a severe woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair, pulled into a bun, so tight it seemed to pull her entire face upward. She sat behind a neat desk, her posture military straight, and regarded Naomi with cool appraisal. "I want to be very clear about something," Mrs. Patterson said without preamble. "You are here to maintain the household. You clean, you serve, you perform whatever tasks are assigned to you. That is the extent of your responsibilities. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Naomi replied. "You do not interact with Mr. Whitmore unless directly addressed. You do not gossip about the family with other staff. And under no circumstances do you interact with a child." Mrs. Patterson's eyes sharpened on that last point. "Elliot has specialized caregivers. That is not your job. That is not your place. Am I clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am." Mrs. Patterson held her gaze for another moment, then nodded. "Good. You may go." Naomi understood the message. She was help. She was meant to be invisible. She was not to step outside the lines of her position under any circumstances. She followed those rules carefully. When she worked in rooms where Elliot was present, she kept her eyes on her tasks. When she passed him in hallways, she stepped aside without looking directly at him. When she overheard the nannies discussing his lack of progress, she said nothing, but she continued to observe. She couldn't help herself. She noticed that Elliot had patterns. Every morning at breakfast, he would arrange his silverware in specific configurations before ignoring the food entirely. Sometimes it was geometric, triangles, squares, parallel lines. Sometimes it was sequential, fork, knife, spoon, fork, knife, spoon. The arrangements changed daily, but they were never random. She noticed that he responded to rhythm. When a nanny would tap her foot impatiently, Elliot's fingers would tap in response, matching the pattern. When someone walked past with hard-soled shoes clicking against marble, his head would tilt slightly, tracking the sound through vibration. She noticed that he watched faces obsessively, not in a social way. He wasn't trying to make connections. He was studying, learning. When people spoke, he would watch their lips and expressions with fierce concentration, as if trying to decode a foreign language. Most of all, she noticed that he wasn't withdrawn the way everyone assumed. He was listening. He was communicating. No one else was paying close enough attention to see it. One afternoon, Naomi was polishing silver in the formal dining room when she heard raised voices from the next room. She paused, recognizing one of the nannies, Jessica, speaking sharply. "I don't know what else you want me to try, Mr. Whitmore. I have 15 years of experience working with deaf children. This isn't about technique." He's actively resisting engagement. "Then figure out why." Grant's voice came back cold and controlled. "With all due respect, sir, that's a question for his therapist, not his nanny." There was a pause. Then Grant spoke again, and this time his voice carried an edge that made Naomi's hands still. "I have hired 6 therapists in 7 months. None of them have answers. I need someone who can actually reach my son, not someone who can explain why it's impossible." Jessica's response was quiet, defensive. "I'm doing everything I can." "Then do more." Footsteps, sharp and angry. The conversation was over. That evening, Jessica packed her belongings and left. She was the 3rd nanny to quit in the 6 weeks since Naomi had been hired. The pattern was always the same. arrival with confidence, weeks of frustrated attempts, resignation tinged with guilt and relief. The next morning, a new nanny arrived. Her name was Sarah, and she lasted 4 days. Naomi watched the cycle repeat. She watched Grant's frustration harden into something closer to despair. She watched Elliot become more isolated with each failed intervention. She watched, and she said nothing, and she felt something building inside her that she couldn't quite name. Not just sympathy, not just recognition, something more complicated. A pull, an ache. One evening, Naomi was cleaning up after dinner service when she found herself alone in the small breakfast room adjacent to the kitchen. The staff had mostly gone to their quarters. The house was quiet. She had been assigned to polish the silver tea service, a task that would take at least an hour. She worked methodically, her hands moving in familiar patterns, her mind elsewhere. Without thinking, she began to hum. Not a song exactly, just melody, just rhythm. Her mother used to hum while she cooked, a habit Naomi had inherited without realizing it. She was so absorbed in the work that she didn't notice Elliot standing in the doorway. He had come downstairs alone, which wasn't unusual. The nannies had learned not to hover over him constantly. It only made him more resistant. He often wandered the house at night, and the staff had been instructed to leave him alone unless he seemed distressed. He stood in the doorway now, watching Naomi work. His expression was unreadable, but his fingers moved slightly at his sides, tapping against his pajama pants. Talp talp pausa, talp talp pausa, the same rhythm as Naomi's humming. Naomi sensed his presence before she saw him. She glanced up, startled, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second before Elliot looked away. She didn't speak, didn't try to engage him. She simply returned to her work, continuing to hum softly. Elliot remained in the doorway. His fingers kept tapping, matching her rhythm exactly. After a few minutes, Naomi changed her melody slightly, shifting to a different pattern. Talp 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 pausa, talp 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 pausa. Elliot's fingers shifted to match. Naomi felt her heart rate increase, but she kept her expression neutral, her movements steady. She didn't look at him again, didn't draw attention to what was happening. She just continued working, letting the rhythm flow between them like a conversation conducted in a language no one else could hear. When she finished polishing the tea service, she carefully put everything away. She turned off the light in the breakfast room and walked toward the staff quarters. As she passed the doorway where Elliot stood, she didn't look at him, didn't speak. She simply walked by, as if he were invisible. Behind her, she heard the soft pad of small feet heading back upstairs. That night, alone in her room, Naomi sat on the edge of her bed and practiced signs she hadn't used in years. Her hands formed shapes in the dim light, greetings, questions, emotions. She ran through vocabulary, grammar, emotional inflection. She had no plan to use any of it. She was just keeping the language alive, keeping herself ready for something she couldn't name. 2 days later, another nanny quit. This one lasted less than a week. She told Mrs. Patterson that working with Elliot was emotionally exhausting, that she felt like she was failing constantly, that she couldn't take the pressure anymore. Grant exploded. Naomi was in the hallway outside his office when she heard him shouting, not at anyone specific, just shouting into the void, demanding to know why no one could do their job, why everyone gave up, why his son was being treated like an impossible problem instead of a child who needed help. The shouting stopped abruptly. Then came silence. Then, very quietly, the sound of something breaking. Glass, maybe. Something small and sharp. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the office looking pale. She closed the door carefully behind her and walked past Naomi without acknowledging her presence. The next day, Grant made an announcement to the remaining staff. He was bringing in a world-renowned specialist from Switzerland. Dr. Heinrich Vogel had written books on developmental trauma in deaf children. He had a success rate that was apparently extraordinary. He would arrive next week and spend 2 weeks evaluating Elliot. "This is our last attempt," Grant said, his voice flat and exhausted. "If Dr. Vogel can't help him, then we'll have to consider other options." Other options. Everyone understood what that meant. Residential facilities, institutionalization, sending Elliot away. Naomi felt the words like stones in her stomach. She kept her face neutral, her eyes down, her expression carefully blank. It wasn't her place to care. It wasn't her place to object. But she cared anyway. And as she went about her work that day, she caught herself watching Elliot more closely, as if trying to memorize him before he disappeared. The days leading up to Dr. Vogel's arrival felt like waiting for a verdict. The entire household operated under a strange tension, as if everyone understood that something significant was about to happen, but no one wanted to speak it aloud. Naomi continued her work with quiet efficiency, but she felt the weight of the impending evaluation pressing down on everything she did. She found herself watching Elliot more carefully during those days, noticing details she had missed before, cataloging patterns that felt increasingly urgent to understand. Dr. Heinrich Vogel arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in a black car that looked more like a hearse than a vehicle meant for hope. He was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair combed precisely back from a high forehead and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light in sharp angles. He wore a dark suit and carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive and well-traveled. Everything about him communicated authority, expertise, and the kind of confidence that came from decades of being right. Grant met him at the front door personally, shaking his hand with a grip that lasted a fraction too long. Desperation masked as courtesy. Mrs. Patterson hovered nearby, ready to attend to whatever the doctor might need. Two new nannies, recent hires named Caroline and Michelle, stood at attention in the foyer, having been briefed extensively on Dr. Vogel's methods and expectations. Naomi watched from the second-floor landing, ostensibly dusting a table that didn't need dusting. She saw Dr. Vogel's eyes sweep the grand entrance hall with clinical assessment, taking in the marble floors and crystal chandelier and original artwork on the walls. She saw Grant's shoulders tense as he led the doctor toward his office for a preliminary consultation. The evaluation was scheduled to begin that afternoon with another garden luncheon. Grant had insisted on it, wanting to observe Elliot in a social setting, wanting to demonstrate the scope of the problem to the specialist who was supposed to solve it. The setup was similar to the party from weeks earlier: elegant tables, pristine linens, carefully arranged food. This time, however, the guest list was smaller. Just a few close business associates and their families. People who could be trusted to witness what might be another failure without spreading gossip too widely. Elliot was brought to his usual table near the roses. He wore a light blue button-down shirt and khaki pants, his hair recently trimmed, looking like a miniature version of his father. Caroline and Michelle positioned themselves nearby, their postures alert and professional. Dr. Vogel took a seat at a different table with an unobstructed view of the child, a leather notebook open in front of him, a gold pen poised to record observations. Naomi had been assigned to serve drinks during the luncheon. She moved through the space with practiced invisibility, refilling glasses and removing empty plates. Her position gave her the perfect vantage point to observe everything without appearing to observe anything at all. For the first 20 minutes, Dr. Vogel simply watched. He made occasional notes in his precise handwriting, but otherwise remained still. Elliot sat at his table with his usual untouched plate, his gaze directed somewhere past the garden toward the tree line. His hands rested on either side of his silverware, fingers occasionally twitching but otherwise motionless. Then Dr. Vogel stood. He approached Elliot's table with measured steps, his expression neutral and clinical. Caroline and Michelle stepped back respectfully, giving the expert room to work. Several guests noticed and fell silent, curiosity overcoming politeness. Dr. Vogel sat down directly across from Elliot. He placed his hands flat on the table, palms down, and leaned forward slightly. When he spoke, his voice was firm and clear, each word enunciated with precision. "Elliot, my name is Dr. Vogel. I'm here to help you." Nothing. No response. Elliot's eyes didn't shift toward the doctor at all. Dr. Vogel's expression didn't change. He raised his hands and began to sign. His technique was flawless, textbook perfect, each gesture crisp and exact. He signed his introduction again, then waited. Still nothing. "Elliot, I need you to look at me." Dr. Vogel's voice carried an edge now. Not quite impatience, but something firmer. Expectation. We cannot make progress if you refuse to engage. He reached across the table and placed his hand directly in Elliot's line of sight, waving slightly to capture attention. The gesture was clinical, almost aggressive in its insistence. Elliot's entire body went rigid. His shoulders pulled up toward his ears, his hands curled into fists against his thighs, and his breathing became shallow and quick. Every line of his posture screamed discomfort. Dr. Vogel withdrew his hand, but continued speaking, undeterred. This defensive response is typical of trauma-based withdrawal. The key is persistent, structured intervention. He wasn't speaking to Elliot anymore, but to Grant, who had moved closer to observe. You must establish that engagement is not optional. The child must learn that communication is a requirement, not a choice. Naomi felt something cold settle in her chest. She stood near the beverage table, holding a pitcher of iced tea, watching this interaction unfold. She saw Elliot shrink further into himself with each word the doctor spoke. She saw the way his fingers trembled against his legs. She saw the panic building behind his carefully blank expression. Dr. Vogel tried several more approaches over the next 15 minutes. He showed Elliot picture cards. He demonstrated objects, a ball, a book, a toy car, and attempted to engage him in parallel play. He used a tablet with communication software, holding it directly in front of Elliot's face. Each attempt was technically correct, methodologically sound, and completely ineffective. Finally, Dr. Vogel stood, brushing imaginary dust from his suit. He turned to Grant with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and condescending. As I suspected, the withdrawal is profound. This will require intensive intervention. I recommend we begin a structured program immediately, 6 hours daily, incorporating multiple modalities. Grant nodded, his jaw tight. He looked at his son, still frozen at the table, and something in his face cracked just slightly before he forced it back into place. The luncheon continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations became quieter, more subdued. Several guests made excuses to leave early. Elliot remained at his table, untouched food growing cold, his small hands now resting flat against the tablecloth. Naomi noticed something the others had missed. Elliot's right index finger was moving, just barely, tracing shapes on the white linen. Over and over, the same shape, a circle, perfect and continuous. Around and around and around. An anxiety loop, a self-soothing mechanism, a silent scream that no one else was seeing. She set down the pitcher of tea and picked up a serving tray that needed to be cleared. As she moved past Elliot's table, she paused to collect an empty water glass from a nearby chair. Her hands worked automatically, arranging items on the tray, but her right index finger, the one closest to Elliot, began moving against the silver surface. A circle, the same circle Elliot was tracing, slow and deliberate, not facing him, not demanding his attention, just existing in the same space, making the same shape. She saw Elliot's finger still, saw his eyes flicker toward her hand, saw him watch the circle she was creating. Naomi continued the motion for a few seconds, then slowly changed it. She let the circle spiral inward, tightening gradually until it reached a center point. Then she stopped, picked up the tray, and walked away. She didn't look back. She didn't check to see if he had noticed. She simply moved on to her next task, clearing tables and refilling glasses as if nothing had happened. Behind her, after several long seconds, Elliot's finger began moving again. This time, instead of tracing circles, he created a spiral, inward and inward until it reached a point. Then he stopped. His shoulders dropped slightly. His breathing slowed. The panic that had been building behind his eyes eased back into something calmer. Dr. Vogel, consulting with Grant near the house, noticed none of this. Caroline and Michelle, busy preparing Elliot's afternoon therapy schedule, saw nothing unusual. The remaining guests paid no attention to the silent child at the edge of the garden. But Elliot noticed. For the first time in 7 months, someone had spoken his language without demanding anything in return. That evening, as Naomi was finishing her duties in the dining room, She found a cloth napkin folded near where she had placed a stack of clean linens earlier. It wasn't folded in the standard way the staff had been trained to fold them, a simple rectangle with precise edges. This one had been folded into a spiral shape, each layer wrapping tighter than the last, creating a three-dimensional sculpture that must have taken careful attention to create. Naomi picked it up slowly, turning it in her hands. Her throat felt tight. She looked around the empty room, then carefully tucked the napkin into her apron pocket. The next morning, Grant reviewed the security footage from the luncheon. He did this obsessively now, watching and rewatching interactions with Elliot, searching for clues that might explain his son's silence. He had watched Dr. Vogel's intervention 3 times, taking notes, trying to understand why it had failed like all the others. Then he noticed something he had missed during the actual event. A moment near the end of the luncheon. The camera angle showed Elliot's table from above, capturing both him and the maid. Naomi, he remembered her name was, as she moved past with a tray. Grant leaned closer to the screen. He watched Elliot's finger tracing circles. Watched Naomi's finger doing the same thing on her tray. Watched the spiral. Watched his son's entire body language change from rigid panic to something softer. Grant replayed the sequence 4 times. Then he sat back in his chair, staring at the frozen image on the screen. The maid. The woman he had barely noticed. The staff member who was supposed to be invisible. She had done something small and quiet and undeniable. She had reached his son in a way that no specialist, no therapist, no expensive expert had managed. He felt a complicated knot of emotions tighten in his chest. Hope, yes, but also suspicion, resentment, fear. Who was this woman? What gave her the right to do what trained professionals couldn't? What if she was somehow manipulating the situation? What if this was coincidence, not connection? But then he watched the footage again and saw the spiral napkin Elliot had created later, left carefully where Naomi would find it. Communication. Deliberate. Chosen. Grant closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of his office, trying to decide what to do with this information. The summons came the next afternoon. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the laundry room where Naomi was folding linens and informed her, in a tone that allowed for no questions, that Mr. Whitmore required her presence in his office immediately. Naomi's stomach dropped. She carefully set down the sheet she had been folding, smoothed her uniform, and followed Mrs. Patterson through the house. The walk felt endless. She ran through possibilities in her mind. Had she done something wrong? Had someone complained about her work? Was she being fired? Mrs. Patterson knocked once on the office door, then opened it without waiting for a response. "The maid, sir," she announced, as if Naomi were a package being delivered. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. You may go." Grant's voice was controlled, giving nothing away. Mrs. Patterson left, closing the door behind her. Naomi stood just inside the office, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes down. The room smelled of leather and expensive scotch. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 2 walls. A massive desk dominated the space, and behind it sat Grant Whitmore, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied her with an intensity that made Naomi's skin prickle. Then he gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Seat." It wasn't a request. Naomi sat, keeping her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap. Grant turned his laptop toward her. On the screen was frozen security footage, her standing near Elliot's table, her finger tracing shapes on a serving tray. He pressed play. They watched the sequence together in silence. When it ended, Grant closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. "Care to explain what I just watched?" Naomi chose her words carefully. "I was clearing tables, sir. That's not what I'm asking about." His voice sharpened. "You engaged with my son. You were specifically instructed not to interact with him under any circumstances. Yet here you are, deliberately communicating with him behind my back." "I didn't speak to him, sir. I didn't approach him directly. Don't play semantic games with me." Grant's jaw tightened. "You knew exactly what you were doing. That wasn't random. That was deliberate communication." Naomi met his eyes for the first time. "Yes, sir. It was." The admission seemed to catch him off guard. He had expected denial, excuses, deflection. Instead, she gave him honesty, direct and unadorned. "Who do you think you are?" The question came out harsh, almost angry. Do you have any idea how many specialists have tried to reach my son? How many trained professionals with decades of experience have failed? And you, a maid with no credentials, no authority. You think you could just waltz in and fix him? I wasn't trying to fix him, sir. Naomi's voice remained calm, steady. I was listening. He's deaf. Grant said it like he was explaining something obvious to someone stupid. There's nothing to listen to. Naomi felt something shift inside her. A line being drawn. She could back down now, apologize, promise never to overstep again. She could keep her job and her safety and her invisibility. But then she thought of Elliot's finger tracing circles, the spiral napkin, the 7 months of silence that wasn't really silence at all. That's not what deaf means, she said quietly. The words hung in the air between them. Grant's expression darkened, a storm gathering behind his eyes. Excuse me? Being deaf doesn't mean he's not communicating. It means people aren't listening in the right language. Naomi kept her voice gentle but firm. He's been talking this whole time. The patterns with his silverware, the way he responds to rhythm, the shapes he creates. He's telling everyone exactly what he needs. No one's paying attention. Grant stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. He moved to the window, his back to Naomi, his shoulders rigid with tension. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. You've been working here for less than a month. You've had minimal contact with my son. You have no training, no credentials, no authority. And yet you're standing here telling me that I don't understand my own child. I'm not saying that, sir. Then what exactly are you saying? I'm saying that sometimes understanding doesn't come from training. It comes from recognition. Naomi paused, then added softly, I had a cousin. He was deaf. He taught me that listening isn't just about sound. Grant turned from the window, studying her with new intensity. And what makes you think your experience with one child qualifies you to assess my son's condition? It doesn't qualify me for anything. Naomi met his gaze steadily. But it helps me see what he's trying to say. Then enlightened me. The sarcasm in his voice was sharp. What is my son saying? Naomi took a breath. This was the line. Once she crossed it, there would be no going back. He's saying that he's afraid. That everyone who tries to reach him wants something from him. A response, a reaction, proof that their methods work. They need him to validate their expertise. He can feel that need, and it makes him shut down harder. And you don't need anything from him? No, sir. I just noticed him. Grant laughed, but there was no humor in it. You noticed him. That's your revolutionary approach? Noticing. Sometimes that's all it takes. The simplicity of the statement seemed to anger him more than defiance would have. Stay away from my son, he said, his voice cold and final. You're here to clean, not to play therapist. If I catch you interacting with Elliot again in any capacity, you're fired. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sir. Naomi stood, smoothing her uniform. Perfectly clear. She turned toward the door. Wait. Grant's voice stopped her. She turned back. It looked like he wanted to say something else, something that didn't quite fit the anger he was projecting. But then the moment passed, and his expression hardened again. You're dismissed. Naomi left the office, closing the door quietly behind her. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her sides and walked back to the laundry room with her head high, even though her heart was pounding hard enough to hurt. That evening, during dinner service, Elliot had a breakdown. It started without warning. One moment, he was sitting quietly at his usual spot in the small dining room, while Grant met with associates in the formal dining area. The next moment, Elliot was standing, his chair knocked backward, his face twisted in something beyond frustration, pure, overwhelming desperation. He grabbed his plate and threw it. The ceramic shattered against the wall, food splattering across expensive wallpaper. Then the glass. Then the silverware. Each throw was precise and controlled. Not random violence, but targeted destruction. Caroline and Michelle rushed toward him, trying to calm him, trying to restrain him gently. Elliot pulled away from them, backing into a corner. His mouth opened in what might have been a scream, though no sound came out. His hands moved frantically, not in formal signs, but in desperate, broken gestures that meant nothing and everything. The noise, or rather, the crash of breaking dishes, brought Grant running from the formal dining room. He burst through the door and froze, taking in the scene. His son, cornered and wild-eyed. The two nannies hovering helplessly. The destruction scattered across the floor. Elliot. Grant's voice cut through the chaos. Stop this right now. But Elliot wasn't hearing him. Wasn't seeing anything except whatever nightmare was playing behind his eyes. His hands kept moving, kept forming shapes that almost looked like signs but weren't quite complete, like someone trying to speak a language they had forgotten. Grant moved closer, more slowly now. Elliot, please. Calm down. We can. Elliot's hand shot out, pointing, not at Grant, not at the nannies. Across the room, through the open doorway, into the hall beyond. Naomi stood in that hallway. She had been passing by when she heard the crash, had stopped because her instincts told her something was wrong. She stood in the doorway now, frozen, watching the scene unfold. Elliot's eyes locked on her. His hands continued moving, forming one specific gesture over and over. It took Naomi a moment to recognize it. The sign was old, outdated, not taught in modern ASL. But she knew it. She had seen it in her mother's old books, had learned it when studying the evolution of sign language. Where? Elliot was asking where someone was. Not looking for a place. Looking for a person. The way a child might ask where their mother was. The gesture Catherine had used. The gesture only someone who knew the older forms of signing would recognize. The room seemed to freeze. Everyone was looking at Naomi now. Caroline and Michelle looked confused. Grant looked stricken, recognition dawning in his eyes. Naomi took one step forward, then stopped herself. She remembered Grant's warning. Stay away from Elliot. Don't interact. Don't cross that line. But Elliot's entire body was shaking. His breathing was rapid and shallow. The panic attack was escalating, and no one in that room could reach him. She looked at Grant. Their eyes met across the chaos and broken dishes and desperate child. She saw fear there. Real, raw fear. Not of her. Of losing his son completely. The question hung between them. Unspoken but clear. What matters more? Pride or help? Authority or connection? Naomi took another step forward. Grant didn't stop her. She crossed the room slowly, carefully avoiding the broken ceramic. She didn't rush, didn't speak, didn't make any sudden movements. When she was a few feet from Elliot, she stopped, and she slowly raised her hands and signed back. Here, one word, simple and clear, using the same old form he had used. Meeting him where he was, not where people thought he should be. Elliot's breathing stuttered. His hands stopped their frantic movement. He stared at Naomi like she was something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, but did. She signed again, expanding slightly. You're safe. I see you. The words weren't just translated. They were meant. Every gesture carried weight, intention, presence. This wasn't performance. This wasn't technique. This was recognition. Elliot's shoulders dropped. The rigidity left his spine. He took one shaky breath, then another. The breakdown didn't vanish completely. The trauma was still there, the grief and fear and confusion. But it receded enough that he could breathe. Enough that he was present again instead of lost. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. The first conscious acknowledgement he had given anyone in 7 months. The room remained silent. Grant stood frozen, his carefully constructed world cracking open right in front of him. Caroline whispered something to Michelle about credentials and appropriate boundaries, but her voice sounded hollow even to herself. Dr. Vogel, who had appeared in the doorway at some point during the crisis, cleared his throat. This is highly inappropriate. The staff member is engaging in emotional manipulation. She's creating a dependency that will ultimately harm the child's development. This should be stopped immediately. Grant raised one hand, silencing the doctor without looking at him. His eyes were still on his son, on Naomi, on the impossible thing that had just happened. Get out, he said quietly. Dr. Vogel blinked. I'm sorry. I said get out. You're fired. Mr. Whitmore, I must protest. Your services are no longer required. Mrs. Patterson will handle your payment. Leave. Now. The doctor's face flushed red, but he had enough sense not to argue further. He turned sharply and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Grant looked at Naomi. His expression was complex. Anger and gratitude and fear and something that might have been hope all tangled together. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "Can you stay with him? Just for tonight, until he calms down completely." It wasn't phrased as an order this time. It was a request, almost a plea. Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." "And Naomi?" He paused, struggling with words. "Thank you." She didn't respond to that, just turned her attention back to Elliot, who was watching her with eyes that held more awareness than anyone had seen in months. That night, long after Elliot had been settled and the broken dishes cleaned away, Naomi sat alone in her room. She didn't turn on the lights, just sat in the darkness, feeling the weight of what had happened settle over her. Outside her door, she heard a soft sound. When she opened it, she found a cloth napkin folded into a spiral. Next to it was a small piece of paper with 3 words written in a child's careful handwriting. "You stayed here." Naomi picked up both items, tears burning behind her eyes, and closed her door quietly. Everything had changed, and there was no going back. The morning after Elliot's breakdown, the entire household moved differently. Staff members spoke in hushed tones, their usual routines disrupted by an unspoken awareness that something fundamental had shifted. Mrs. Patterson walked the halls with tight lips and narrowed eyes, her disapproval radiating like heat. The 2 nannies, Caroline and Michelle, packed their belongings without being asked to leave. They simply understood their services were no longer required. Grant hadn't slept. He sat in his office as dawn broke, staring at the same security footage he had watched a dozen times. The moment when his son signed where played on a loop in his mind. That single gesture, outdated, desperate, heartbreaking, had torn away every excuse he had built around his failure to reach Elliot. His son hadn't stopped communicating. Grant had stopped listening in a language that mattered. The realization sat heavy in his chest, sharp and unforgiving. Catherine had known that sign. She had used it daily with Elliot, part of their private vocabulary that blended old forms with new. Grant had been present for thousands of those conversations, watching from the sidelines, never quite learning the language himself. Too busy, too important, too confident that his wife would always be there to translate. Now she was gone, and Elliot had been asking where she was for 7 months. Asking in a language only one person in this entire estate had bothered to learn. A maid, a woman he had barely noticed until yesterday. A woman who had seen his son more clearly in 3 weeks than Grant had in 7 months. Around 8 in the morning, Grant summoned Naomi to the breakfast room. Not his office this time. Somewhere less formal, less confrontational. He sat at the small table where Elliot usually took his meals, 2 cups of coffee growing cold in front of him. Naomi entered quietly, her uniform pressed and neat, her expression carefully neutral. She didn't sit until Grant gestured to the chair across from him. "I owe you an apology," Grant said without preamble. The words felt foreign in his mouth, rough and unpracticed. "Yesterday, I accused you of overstepping. I was wrong." Naomi said nothing, just watched him with those calm, observant eyes. "You were right," he continued, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. "I wasn't listening. I was so focused on fixing him, on finding the right expert or the right method, that I missed what he was actually trying to say." He paused, his jaw working. His mother would have seen it immediately. "You were grieving too," Naomi said softly. "It's hard to see clearly when you're drowning." The kindness in her voice nearly undid him. Grant looked away, composing himself. "I need your help, not as staff, as someone who understands my son better than I do right now." The admission cost him something, but he forced it out anyway. "Will you stay? Work with Elliot? Help him. Help us find a way forward." Naomi was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made Grant look at her more closely. "This isn't temporary for him. You understand that, right? I can't be someone who comes into his life, builds his trust, and then disappears when it becomes inconvenient. If I do this, I need to know you're committed to seeing it through. Whatever that looks like." "I am," Grant said immediately. "Whatever it takes. Even if people judge you for it. Even if your business associates think it's strange that a maid has access to your son." even if your family questions your judgment. Grant's expression hardened, but not with anger. With resolve. Let them question. My son comes first. Naomi studied him for another moment, then nodded. Okay, but I have conditions. Name them. I'm not a therapist. I won't pretend to be. Elliot needs professional support. Real support, not people trying to force him into boxes. But those professionals need to understand that communication isn't one size fits all. She leaned forward slightly. And I need you to be part of this. You need to learn his language too. Not just watch from the sidelines. Actually learn it. Grant felt something in his chest tighten. Fear, maybe, or shame. But he nodded. I'll do it. One more thing, Naomi added. This stays about him. Not about proving anything to anyone. Not about optics or image or what makes you look like a good father. Just him. His needs. His pace. Agreed. They sat in silence for a moment. An understanding settling between them that felt more binding than any formal contract. He left something outside my door last night, Naomi said quietly. A note. It said you stayed here. Past tense. Like he was surprised. Grant closed his eyes briefly. Everyone else left. Every nanny, every therapist, every specialist. They all gave up and walked away. Of course he expected you to leave too. I won't, Naomi said simply. Not unless he asks me to. That afternoon, Elliot came downstairs to find Naomi waiting in the small sitting room adjacent to the library. She didn't rush toward him or make a big production of the moment. She simply sat in a chair near the window, afternoon light streaming through the glass, and acknowledged his presence with a small nod. Elliot stood in the doorway for several minutes, just watching, testing, seeing if she would push or demand or need something from him. Naomi pulled out a sketch pad and a set of colored pencils. She began drawing, nothing specific, just shapes and patterns. Spirals, circles, geometric designs. She worked quietly, humming softly under her breath the way she had that night in the breakfast room weeks ago. Slowly, tentatively, Elliot moved into the room. He didn't sit next to her. He sat on the floor, near the bookshelf, several feet away, where he could see what she was doing without being too close. Naomi noticed, but didn't comment. Just kept drawing. After a while, she set down one colored pencil and picked up another. Red instead of blue. She drew a new spiral, this one tighter and more complex. Elliot watched her hand move. His own fingers twitched against his knee, mimicking the motion unconsciously. Then he signed something, small and quick, as if testing whether she was really paying attention. More. Naomi's hand stilled. She looked at him, not with excitement or triumph, just quiet acknowledgement. Then she drew another spiral, and another, creating a pattern across the page. Elliot signed again, more confidently this time. Different. Naomi changed the pattern, made the spirals irregular, made some large and some small, created asymmetry where there had been order. Elliot's shoulders relaxed. He moved slightly closer, still on the floor, but no longer pressed against the wall. He signed a more complex thought, his hands moving with increasing fluidity. She made patterns, different every time. He was talking about his mother. Naomi understood immediately. She sounds creative. Naomi signed back, keeping her movements gentle and unhurried. She was teaching me. Elliot's hands moved faster now, 7 months of silence breaking open like a dam, finally cracking. We were going to make a book, with all the patterns. She said patterns tell stories. What kind of stories? Any kind. Elliot's expression flickered with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Happy ones. Sad ones. Angry ones. She said every feeling has a shape. Naomi set down the sketch pad. She signed carefully, giving Elliot time to process each word. What shape is today? Elliot thought about that. His hands moved through several different attempts before settling on an answer. Broken circle. Trying to close, but doesn't know how. The honesty of it stole Naomi's breath. She nodded slowly. That's a good shape. Honest. They sat together in that room for 2 hours. Sometimes signing. Sometimes just existing in parallel silence. Naomi never pushed. Never demanded more than Elliot was willing to offer. And slowly, incrementally, he began to unfold. Later that evening, Naomi found Grant in his study. She knocked softly, and he looked up from his laptop with exhausted eyes. He talked, she said simply. Really talked. About his mother. About patterns they used to make together. Grant's expression cracked. What did he say? Naomi told him, watching as each detail landed like a stone in water. When she finished, Grant was quiet for a long time. I didn't know about the book, he finally said, his voice rough. She never told me about the pattern book. Maybe she was waiting for the right time, Naomi offered. Or maybe it was their special thing. Something just for them. Grant nodded slowly, then looked at Naomi with something that might have been desperation. Teach me. The signing. The way you do it. Not textbook. The way that actually reaches him. It's not just about the signs, Naomi warned. It's about intention. Presence. Being willing to exist in his world instead of demanding he exist in yours. I know, Grant said quietly. I'm ready to try. That night, Naomi lay in her small room and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had taken on. The responsibility was enormous. Elliot's trust was fragile, hard-won, and could shatter at any moment. Grant's commitment was real but new, untested under pressure, and the household staff's resentment was already building like storm clouds on the horizon. She thought about quitting, about walking away before she became too invested, before the inevitable complications arose, before caring too much made everything hurt more. But then she remembered Elliot's hands signing, "You stayed here," and she knew she couldn't leave. Not now. Maybe not ever. The news spread through the household like wildfire within days. The maid, that quiet, unremarkable woman who cleaned tables and polished silver, now had special access to the young master. She spent hours alone with him in the sitting room. She took her meals in the small breakfast room where Elliot ate. She had the authority to request specific foods, specific activities, specific accommodations for the boy. The whispers started immediately. Mrs. Patterson was the first to vocalize her concerns, cornering Grant in the hallway outside his office 3 days after Naomi's new role began. "Sir, I must speak with you about this arrangement." Grant, who had been on his way to join Elliot and Naomi for lunch, something he was doing daily now, learning to sign through observation and practice, stopped reluctantly. "What is it, Mrs. Patterson?" "It's highly irregular, sir. Having someone with no credentials, no professional training, given such unrestricted access to a vulnerable child." Mrs. Patterson's voice was tight with disapproval. "The other staff members are concerned. They're questioning your judgment." "Let them question," Grant said flatly. "Naomi is helping my son in ways no one else has managed. That's all that matters." "But sir, the optics." "I don't care about optics." Grant's voice sharpened. "I care about my son. If you have concerns about Naomi's conduct specifically, actual misconduct, not just discomfort with the arrangement, bring them to me with evidence. Otherwise, this conversation is over." Mrs. Patterson's mouth thinned into a hard line. "Very well, sir." She turned and walked away, her spine rigid with offense. But the concerns didn't stop there. They multiplied. The cook mentioned to the gardener that it seemed strange, giving so much authority to someone so new. The gardener mentioned to the driver that it made him uncomfortable, the way the maid had wormed her way into the family's trust. The driver mentioned to the head of security that maybe they should keep a closer eye on things, just to be safe. Within a week, Mrs. Patterson filed a formal complaint through the household management system. The document was precise and carefully worded, accusing Naomi of creating emotional dependency in a vulnerable child, of overstepping professional boundaries, and of manipulating the situation for personal gain. It stopped just short of accusing her of intentional harm, but the implications were clear. Grant read the complaint in his office, his jaw clenching tighter with each paragraph. When he finished, he called Naomi in to discuss it. "I need you to read this," he said, handing her the document. "And I need your honest reaction." Naomi read slowly, her expression remaining calm even as the accusations piled up. When she finished, she set the papers down carefully. "They're afraid," she said simply. "Of what?" "Of change. Of someone disrupting the established order. Of the fact that I'm reaching Elliot when people with more credentials couldn't." She paused. "And maybe they're afraid that I'll take advantage of that access." Use it for money or position or attention. Will you? Grant asked, watching her closely. No. The word was firm, unequivocal. I'm here for him. That's all. Grant believed her, but he also understood that belief wasn't enough in the world he occupied. Perception mattered. Whispers became rumors. Rumors became scandals. And scandals destroyed reputations faster than any truth could rebuild them. That evening, Grant hosted a small dinner for close business associates, people he considered friends as much as colleagues. Naomi served, as she often did during formal dinners, moving through the room with quiet efficiency. One of the guests, a silver-haired investor named Thomas Bradford, watched Naomi refill his wine glass and then leaned toward Grant with a knowing smile. I heard you've got quite the situation developing here. The help getting a bit too familiar with the family? Grant's hand tightened around his own wine glass. I'm not sure what you mean. Come on, Grant. Word gets around. You've given some Maid carte blanche with your son. People are talking. Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm sure you have your reasons, but you need to think about how this looks. Optics matter in our world. Elliot is responding to her, Grant said tightly. After months of failed interventions, he's finally making progress. That's what matters. Does it? Thomas set down his glass. Because what I'm hearing is that you've allowed an uncredentialed staff member to bypass every professional recommendation. That you've given her authority she hasn't earned. That looks like desperation, Grant. Or worse, poor judgment. Or it looks like a father doing whatever it takes to help his son. It looks like vulnerability. Another guest interjected, Margaret Hollis, a board member of one of Grant's charitable foundations. And vulnerability invites scrutiny. Lawsuits, questions about your capacity to make sound decisions in other areas of your life. Grant felt anger rise hot in his throat. Are you seriously suggesting that helping my son makes me incapable of running my businesses? I'm suggesting that the methods you're using are questionable, Margaret said coolly, and that you need to consider the broader implications. What happens if this woman decides she wants more? What happens if she claims some kind of emotional bond with your son and demands compensation, or custody rights, or threatens to go public with a story about how you gave a black maid access to your vulnerable white child in ways that could be misinterpreted? The racial element had been lurking beneath every criticism, unspoken but present. Margaret had finally voiced it, and the room went silent. Grant stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. Get out. Margaret blinked. Excuse me. I said get out. All of you. This dinner is over. Grant, we're trying to help you. By suggesting that Naomi is dangerous because of her race? By implying that her competence is somehow suspicious because she doesn't have the right credentials or the right background? Grant's voice was cold with fury. No, you're not helping. You're revealing exactly the kind of thinking that's kept my son isolated for 7 months. The assumption that caring has to look a certain way, come from certain people, follow certain rules. You're wrong, and I want you out of my house. The guests exchanged uncomfortable looks, then began gathering their belongings. Thomas tried one more time. You're making a mistake, Grant. This will come back to haunt you. Then let it haunt me. At least I'll have helped my son. After they left, Grant stood alone in the dining room, his hands shaking with anger and something that felt like fear. Had he made the right choice? Was he being reckless? Was he putting Elliot at risk by trusting Naomi so completely? Naomi appeared in the doorway, having heard most of the confrontation from the hall. You should listen to them, she said quietly. Grant turned to her, startled. What? They're not entirely wrong. The optics are bad. The situation is unusual, and I am creating a dependency with Elliot. She stepped into the room, her expression serious. If you need me to step back, I will. If protecting him means protecting you from criticism, then maybe that's what needs to happen. No, Grant said immediately. No, you're not leaving. But if it's hurting you, I don't care if it hurts me. Grant moved closer, his voice intense. I care if it hurts Elliot, and losing you would destroy him. I'm not letting that happen. Naomi held his gaze for a long moment. Okay, then we do this together, and we deal with whatever comes. But what came next was worse than criticism. Grant's brother, Richard Whitmore, arrived at the estate 2 days later with a lawyer. Richard was younger by 3 years, sharper in appearance, colder in demeanor. He had always resented Grant's position as head of the family business, and he seized on this situation like a weapon he'd been waiting to find. "I'm filing for emergency custody evaluation," Richard announced in Grant's office, his lawyer standing silently behind him with a briefcase full of documents. "On the grounds that you're making decisions that endanger Elliot's welfare." Grant stared at his brother in disbelief. "You're trying to take my son?" "I'm trying to protect my nephew from your increasingly erratic behavior." Richard's tone was smooth, practiced. "You've fired multiple qualified specialists. You've given unrestricted access to an uncredentialed staff member. You're isolating him from professional help. A judge will see that as unstable. Elliot is improving. He's communicating again. He's eating regularly. He's dependent on a woman who could walk away at any moment, leaving him more traumatized than before," Richard interrupted. "That's not improvement. That's creating a new problem." The lawyer stepped forward, handing Grant a folder. "These are preliminary filings. We're requesting a full psychological evaluation of both you and the child, as well as an investigation into the appropriateness of the current care arrangements. You'll have an opportunity to respond through your own legal counsel." Grant felt the world tilt. This wasn't just criticism anymore. This was a real threat. Richard could actually take Elliot away, put him in a facility, undo everything that had been built over the past few weeks. "Why are you doing this?" Grant asked his brother, his voice hollow. Richard's expression softened slightly, almost convincingly. "Because someone has to. You're not thinking clearly. You're so desperate to fix Elliot that you're grasping at anything that seems to work, even if it's not sustainable, even if it's potentially harmful." "Get out," Grant said quietly. "Grant, get out of my house. And tell your lawyer that if you want to fight, he'll get one. But I'm not giving him my son." After they left, Grant sat alone in his office for a long time. He thought about calling his own lawyers, about preparing for a custody battle that could tear his family apart publicly, about the possibility of losing Elliot to his brother's cold, calculated care. But mostly, he thought about the moment yesterday when Elliot had signed to him directly for the first time. A simple question: "Are you learning to?" Grant had signed back, clumsy but earnest. "Yes. Teach me." And Elliot had smiled. A real, genuine smile. The first one since Catherine died. That memory steeled his resolve. Whatever it cost, whatever battles he had to fight, Grant wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. He found Naomi in the sitting room with Elliot, working on a new pattern book together. They looked up as he entered, and Grant saw the question in Naomi's eyes. She had heard about Richard's visit. "We're going to be okay," Grant signed to Elliot, the movement still awkward, but clear enough. "All of us." Elliot looked at his father, then at Naomi, then back at his father. His hands moved in a sign Grant had learned just yesterday. "Together." "Together," Grant confirmed. And for the first time in 7 months, Grant Whitmore felt like he might actually keep that promise. The custody evaluation process began 2 weeks after Richard's threat. A court-appointed psychologist named Dr. Anna Reeves arrived at the estate with a briefcase full of assessment tools and a carefully neutral expression. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a methodical approach, someone who had clearly evaluated hundreds of complicated family situations and learned not to make assumptions. Grant met her at the door personally, his anxiety barely concealed beneath a veneer of professional courtesy. "Thank you for coming, Dr. Reeves." "Mr. Whitmore." She shook his hand firmly. "I want to be clear about my role here. I'm not here to take sides. I'm here to assess what's in Elliot's best interest. That means I'll need access to everyone involved. You, your son, and Ms. Clark. Of course, whatever you need." Dr. Reeves spent the first day observing. She watched Grant and Elliot at breakfast, noting how Grant signed with increasing confidence, how Elliot responded with patience when his father made mistakes. She watched Naomi work with Elliot in the sitting room, documenting the ease of their communication, the way Elliot relaxed in her presence. She reviewed medical records, therapy notes from the failed interventions, and security footage from the past month. On the second day, she interviewed Grant alone in his office. Tell me about your decision to allow Ms. Clark to work with Elliot, she said, her pen poised over her notepad. Grant chose his words carefully. Every specialist I hired approached my son like a problem to be solved. Naomi approached him like a person to be understood. The difference was immediate and undeniable. But she has no formal credentials. She has something more important, the ability to see him, to listen in ways that don't require sound. Grant leaned forward. My son was dying inside, Dr. Reeves. Not physically, but emotionally. He was disappearing. Naomi brought him back. I don't care what her resume says. And if she leaves? If she decides this is too much responsibility or finds another opportunity? What happens to Elliot then? The question hit Grant like a physical blow because he had asked himself the same thing 100 times. Then we deal with it. But pushing her away now, when he's finally healing, would cause more damage than any hypothetical future loss. Dr. Reeves made notes, her expression unreadable. Your brother suggests you're acting out of desperation rather than sound judgment. My brother wants control of my assets, Grant said bluntly. He's using my son as a weapon to get it. If he truly cared about Elliot's welfare, he would have visited once in the 7 months since my wife died. He didn't. Not until he saw an opportunity. On the third day, Dr. Reeves interviewed Naomi in the small breakfast room. Why did you get involved? She asked. You could have stayed in your role as household staff. You chose to cross a significant boundary. Why? Naomi considered the question carefully. Because no one else was seeing him. They were seeing deafness, trauma, resistance. They weren't seeing a child who was communicating as clearly as he could and being ignored. You understand that you've created a significant dependency. Elliot relies on you in ways that could be problematic if you're not committed long-term. I am committed, Naomi said firmly. I wouldn't have started this if I wasn't prepared to see it through. Even if it costs you other opportunities, even if it limits your own freedom. Even then, Naomi met Dr. Reeves's eyes steadily. I had a cousin who was deaf. The world tried to force him to communicate on its terms. It almost broke him. My aunt and I learned to meet him where he was instead. It saved his life. I'm not going to let Elliot go through what Marcus almost went through. Dr. Reeves made more notes. You understand that emotional connection isn't the same as professional competence. Yes, that's why I've been researching certification programs. I want to formalize what I'm doing, not replace professional support, but complement it. Naomi paused. But credentials won't make me care more than I already do. They'll just make other people more comfortable with the fact that I care. On the fourth day, Dr. Reeves spent time alone with Elliot. She had arranged for Naomi and Grant to be elsewhere in the house, wanting to see how Elliot functioned without his support system immediately present. She entered the sitting room where Elliot was working on his pattern book, a large sketch pad filled with spirals and geometric shapes, each page more complex than the last. He glanced up when she entered, acknowledged her presence with a small nod, then returned to his drawing. Dr. Reeves sat across from him, not too close. She pulled out a tablet with communication software and showed it to Elliot. He looked at it briefly, then signed a simple response. Don't need it. Dr. Reeves signed back, her movements textbook perfect, but lacking the fluidity Naomi had. I want to understand how you're feeling. Elliot studied her for a moment, then set down his colored pencil. His hands moved in more complex signs. You want to know if she's good for me? The directness startled Dr. Reeves. Yes. That's part of what I'm trying to understand. She stayed. Elliot's signs were emphatic. Everyone else left. She stayed. But staying isn't always enough. Sometimes people stay for the wrong reasons. Elliot's expression shifted, something stubborn and certain settling into his features. He signed with deliberate clarity. She sees me. Not the deaf. Not the broken. Me. Do you think you're broken? The question hung between them. Elliot's hands went still. His face closed off, that familiar shutdown beginning to descend. Dr. Reeves recognized the warning signs immediately and shifted her approach. I'm sorry. That was the wrong question. But Elliot was already standing, moving toward the door. Not running, but retreating. Dr. Reeves let him go, making notes about the interaction, about the trigger she had inadvertently hit. Elliot found Naomi in the kitchen, helping prepare lunch. He stood in the doorway until she noticed him, then signed urgently. She asked if I'm broken. Naomi set down the dish she was holding and gave Elliot her full attention. What did you tell her? Nothing. I left. Do you want to talk about it? Elliot's hands trembled slightly as he signed. Mom died because I'm broken. She was always fixing me. She got tired. The words hit Naomi like a punch to the chest. She moved closer to Elliot, kneeling so they were at eye level. Elliot, look at me. Your mother didn't die because of you. She died because something in her brain broke without warning. Nothing you did caused that. Nothing you could have done would have prevented it. I couldn't call for help. Elliot's signs were becoming more frantic. I was in my room. She was downstairs. I didn't hear her fall. If I could hear, if I was normal, I could have saved her. Naomi felt tears burn behind her eyes, but kept her expression steady. You were 9 years old. Even if you could hear, even if you had been right next to her, you couldn't have stopped what happened. It was an aneurysm. It was instant. No one could have saved her. Dad could have, if he answered her call that night. The revelation made Naomi's breath catch. What call? She called him. The night before. He didn't answer. She left a message saying her head hurt. He didn't call back until morning. She was already dead. Elliot's whole body was shaking now. If he had answered, maybe she would have gone to the hospital. Maybe they could have fixed it. Naomi pulled Elliot into a hug, feeling his small body tremble against hers. Oh, sweetheart, that's not how it works. Headaches happen all the time. No one could have known that one was dangerous. Your dad didn't ignore her on purpose. He was probably in a meeting or sleeping. He didn't know, but he should have known. He's supposed to know everything. Parents aren't perfect. They miss things. They make mistakes. They're human. Naomi pulled back slightly to sign where Elliot could see. Your dad has been carrying that guilt too. He thinks he failed both of you. He's been trying so hard to fix everything because he couldn't fix that one terrible thing. Elliot's signs were smaller now, exhausted. I waited for someone to understand. I waited for someone to stay long enough to see. I see you, Naomi signed. I see exactly who you are. And you're not broken. You're grieving. There's a difference. They sat together on the kitchen floor for a long time. Eventually, Naomi felt a presence in the doorway and looked up to find Grant standing there, his face pale. He had heard everything, or rather, seen everything, the conversation playing out in signs he could now read well enough to understand. Grant moved slowly into the kitchen and knelt beside them. His hands moved in careful signs. I am sorry. I should have answered her call. I should have paid attention. I failed both of you. Elliot looked at his father for a long moment. Then he signed something that made Grant's composure finally crack. I waited for you to learn how to talk to me. I'm learning now. Grant signed back, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I let you wait alone. Elliot studied his father's face, seeing the genuine remorse there, the grief that matched his own. Then he signed something that changed everything. Can we wait together now? Grant nodded, unable to speak, and pulled his son into his arms. Elliot let himself be held, really held, for the first time in 7 months. The three of them sat there on the kitchen floor, a strange family held together by grief and understanding and the slow, painful work of healing. Dr. Reeves found them there 20 minutes later. She stood in the doorway, observing the scene, and added one final note to her evaluation. A week later, Dr. Reeves submitted her report to the court. Richard's lawyer called Grant immediately after receiving a copy. We're withdrawing the custody petition, the lawyer said, his tone clipped and professional. Dr. Reeves's evaluation was conclusive. What did it say? Grant asked, though he already suspected. That Elliot is thriving under the current arrangement. That the unorthodox approach is producing measurable positive outcomes. That removing him from Ms. Clark's care would constitute emotional harm. The lawyer paused. She also noted that your brother has had no meaningful contact with the child and appears motivated by financial rather than welfare concerns. Grant closed his eyes, relief washing over him. Thank you for letting me know. Mr. Whitmore? One more thing. Dr. Reeves included a recommendation in her report. She suggests you formalize Ms. Clark's role and provide her with the resources to obtain proper certification. She believes Ms. Clark has the foundation to become an exceptional professional in this field, with the right training and support. After hanging up, Grant found Naomi in the sitting room, helping Elliot with his pattern book. He signed as he spoke, his movements now fluid enough to keep pace with his words. The custody challenge is over. We won. Naomi's relief was visible. Elliot looked between them, understanding the significance even if he hadn't been told all the details. There's something else, Grant continued. Dr. Reeves recommended that I fund your certification. Full training, professional credentials, whatever you need. Not because what you're doing isn't working, but because you deserve recognition for it. Naomi was quiet for a moment. I've been looking into programs. There's one that specializes in emotional communication and trauma-informed signing. It's a 2-year program. Do it, Grant said immediately. Full funding, flexible schedule. You can continue working with Elliot while you study. We'll make it work. What? Naomi asked. Why invest so much in me? Grant looked at his son, who was watching this conversation with calm attention. Then back at Naomi. Because you invested in us when you had no reason to. Because you saw value where everyone else saw problems. Because you deserve the chance to do this for other families, not just ours. 6 months later, the Whitmore estate looked the same from the outside, but felt entirely different from within. The tension that had permeated every room had dissipated, replaced by something that resembled peace. Elliot moved through the house with confidence now, signing freely with staff members who had begun learning basic signs themselves. The hostile whispers had faded, replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. Mrs. Patterson had quietly resigned 2 months earlier, replaced by a younger head housekeeper named Jennifer, who approached her role with less rigidity and more warmth. The remaining staff who had been resistant to change either adapted or found positions elsewhere. Those who stayed began to see Naomi not as an intruder, but as someone who had changed the household for the better. Naomi herself had changed too. She still lived on the estate, but no longer in the staff quarters. Grant had converted a small guest house on the property into a private residence for her, complete with a study where she could complete her coursework and a small garden where she could decompress. She had completed her first semester of certification training with honors, her instructors noting her rare combination of natural talent and lived experience. Grant had also changed. He attended Elliot's therapy sessions now. Real therapy with a trauma specialist named Dr. Keiko Chun, who understood that deafness wasn't a disorder to be fixed, but a difference to be accommodated. He learned not just sign language, but emotional literacy, processing his own grief alongside his son's. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his feelings began to crumble, and what emerged was a father more present and more honest than he had been even before Catherine's death. On a bright afternoon in early autumn, Grant made an announcement at a board meeting for one of his charitable foundations. Naomi sat in the back of the room, having been invited but not told why. I want to talk about failure, Grant began, his voice carrying across the conference room, filled with wealthy donors and community leaders. 7 months after my wife died, my son stopped communicating. I hired the best specialist money could buy. I threw resources at the problem. I demanded results. And every single approach failed. The room was silent, everyone leaning forward slightly. Grant rarely spoke about personal matters in professional settings. I failed because I was looking for experts who could fix my son as if he were broken, as if his silence was a malfunction rather than a response to unbearable grief. Grant's voice remained steady, but emotion threaded through it. The person who finally reached him wasn't the most credentialed. She was the most present, the most willing to listen without needing to be right. He gestured to Naomi. Naomi Clark started as household staff. She's now completing professional certification in deaf education and trauma-informed communication. But more importantly, she saw my son as a complete person when everyone else saw symptoms to manage. That changed everything. Grant pulled up a presentation on the screen behind him. That's why I'm announcing the Catherine Whitmore Foundation for Communication Access. We'll fund training programs for caregivers, parents, and educators who want to learn emotional signing and trauma-informed approaches. We'll provide scholarships for people like Naomi, people with lived experience and natural talent who need resources to formalize their skills. and will advocate for changing how we think about communication differences. The room erupted in quiet conversation. Someone asked about funding levels. Someone else asked about program implementation. Grant answered each question with the kind of passion he usually reserved for business ventures. After the meeting, a few board members approached Naomi directly. One woman, a former teacher, shook her hand warmly. "I've worked with deaf students for 20 years. What you've done, meeting the child where they are instead of where you want them to be, that should be standard practice, not revolutionary. Thank you for reminding us." That evening, Grant hosted a small dinner at the estate. Just family, or what family had become. Grant, Elliot, and Naomi. No formal table settings. No elaborate presentation. Just food and conversation, conducted partially in sign and partially in speech, flowing naturally between both. Elliot was working on his pattern book throughout the meal, adding details to a particularly complex spiral design. He had filled 3 books now, each one documenting different emotional journeys through abstract shapes and colors. His therapist had suggested he might want to share them eventually, that other children dealing with grief might find meaning in them. Grant watched his son work, then signed a question. "Are you happy?" Elliot considered the question seriously before responding. "Not all the time, but enough times. More than before. That's honest." Grant smiled. "What about right now?" This moment, Elliot looked around the table, at his father who had learned his language, at Naomi who had stayed when everyone else left, at the pattern book that was becoming something meaningful. He signed simply, "Right now is good." Later, after Elliot had gone to bed, Grant and Naomi sat in the study, reviewing applications for the Foundation's first scholarship program. They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally discussing candidates or program details. "You're really going to do this?" Naomi said, looking at the funding allocations. "You're committing serious resources. I should have done it years ago. Catherine would have wanted this." Grant set down the papers he was reviewing. She used to talk about creating something for deaf children beyond just education, something that recognized the emotional dimension. "I wasn't ready to hear it then. You're hearing it now, because you made me listen." Grant met her eyes. "You know you don't have to stay here forever, right? Once you're certified, you could go anywhere. Do anything. Help hundreds of families." "I know." Naomi smiled slightly. "But I made a promise to a 9-year-old boy that I would stay. I don't break promises. He's 10 now, and he's strong enough that he'd understand if you needed to move on." "Maybe, but I'm not ready to move on." Naomi paused. "This is the first place I've been in a decade that feels like home. I'm not giving that up easily." Grant nodded, understanding more than she was saying. "For what it's worth, we're grateful. Both of us. It's worth a lot." The Foundation launched officially 3 months later with a gala that Elliot attended, his first public event since his mother's death. He had been nervous about it, about being around so many people, about being perceived as different or broken. But Naomi had helped him prepare, and Grant had promised they could leave at any point if it became too much. The gala featured artwork created by deaf artists, including several pieces from Elliot's pattern books, blown up and professionally framed. He stood in front of one, a complex spiral in blues and purples that he had titled 7 Months, watching people observe it, reading their reactions. A young woman approached him, her movements catching his attention. She signed a question. "Did you create this?" Elliot nodded. "It's beautiful, and sad, and hopeful all at once." She studied the spiral more closely. "I lost my mom too, last year. Sometimes I feel exactly like this looks." Elliot signed back, his movements confident now. "That's why I made it, so people would know they're not alone." The woman smiled, tears in her eyes. "Thank you." After she walked away, Elliot found Naomi in the crowd. He signed to her across the room, and she responded, and several people nearby noticed their conversation. Not with discomfort or confusion, but with interest. The language was becoming less foreign, less intimidating, more beautiful in its clarity. At the end of the evening, Grant gave a short speech. He talked about Catherine, about Elliot, about the journey that had brought them to this point. He talked about failure and learning and the courage it takes to admit you don't have all the answers. "My son taught me that listening doesn't require sound," Grant concluded. It requires presence, patience, and the humility to meet people where they are instead of demanding they come to where we are. That's not just advice for communicating with deaf children. That's advice for being human. The room erupted in applause. Elliot watched from beside Naomi, his expression serious and thoughtful. Then he signed something that made Naomi laugh. "What did he say?" someone nearby asked. Naomi translated. "He said his dad finally learned how to talk." On the drive home, Elliot fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the evening. Grant glanced at him in the rearview mirror, then at Naomi in the passenger seat. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything you've given us." "You gave me something too," Naomi replied. "Purpose, family, a reason to become who I was always supposed to be. Still, thank you." They drove in comfortable silence the rest of the way home. The impossible arrangement that had started with spirals and silence now transformed into something permanent and real. In the back seat, Elliot dreamed of patterns, complex and beautiful, each one telling a story about grief and healing and the people who stay when staying is hard. When he woke up in the morning, he would add new patterns to his book. Patterns about belonging, about being seen, about the impossible becoming possible when someone cares enough to understand. And somewhere in those patterns, between the spirals and the shapes, was the truth no nanny had understood until one Maid saw clearly. That listening is not about hearing. It is about presence. It is about staying. It is about seeing someone completely and choosing to understand their language rather than demanding they speak yours. That truth changed everything. And it started with a simple circle traced on a tablecloth, answered by a spiral that said, "I see you. I'm here. I am staying." If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the power of presence, understanding, and the courage to see people as they truly are.